Anime is a Japanese colloquialism which comes from short.
Here's an idea. Avatar: The Last Airbender and The Legend of Korra.
Here's an idea. Avatar: The Last Airbender is an anime. Fuck you. Fight me.
Why do we need to define anime? I realize a video asking this question is somewhat risky, in that it's based upon my own inability to come up with an answer to this question, for which there very well may be one that I'm simply missing. Well, let it be known that I'm not always an arrogant prick, and I see fit to humble myself on this occasion should someone come along and find that elusive answer. For now though, allow me to indulge and point out why, at least as far as I can see, there isn't actually too pressing a need to define anime. This video was obviously sparked by the recent one from Mother's Basement on this topic, and I think he hits upon the key point here when he goes about stressing just how incredibly difficult it is to define anime. When discussing art and artistic mediums, it's virtually impossible to base definitions upon style, since there will always be some unforeseen creative rule breaker or style remixer that comes along and prevents you from creating a clean delineation between those works that do and do not belong. You'll always get extremely Western-style anime and extremely anime-style cartoons. Similarly, definitions based upon region or producer or target audience will prove to be insufficient, as in this age of globalization, things like outsourcing and strange projects like Shelter, conceived of and produced for a Westerner, but actually made by an almost entirely Japanese staff, and marketed and distributed to a Japanese audience alongside the rest of the world will muddy those waters. Jeff's definition of anime as a movement is a somewhat enticing one, certainly a novel attempt, and actually one of the better definitions at that, but it still falls short. Deeming anime to be a movement gives things enough vagueness to sidestep some of the problems that come with defining art by specific traits, but really only by sidestepping the naming of those common traits entirely. An artistic movement is still defined as a tendency or style in art with a specific common philosophy or goal, so you still need to have that set of criteria laid out at some point. All calling it a movement ultimately does is allow you to answer the question what is anime with an artistic movement, instead of saying something like an art style generally marked by a focus on larger, more expressive eyes, limited motion, and striking framing and poses to make up for that lack of motion. You've answered the question, but only with an ultimately meaningless phrase, because it isn't actually an artistic movement unless you've defined the traits or overarching philosophy that make it a movement. And yet this definition is being employed specifically to avoid defining anime by a set of prerequisite traits, specifically because doing so doesn't really work out that well. There is also the issue caused by an artistic movement needing to have some kind of beginning and end, a set period of time during which it occurs, and that's where the whole individual movements within the greater movement phrasing of Jeff's comes in. So really, one of the better attempts to define anime to date goes about doing so by simply finding a way to circumvent having to concretely define the term. With the idea of anime as a movement that Jeff brings up being, for my money's worth, one that isn't really workable, there's still the way he does actually go about defining what would and would not count as anime to look at. Avatar: The Last Airbender and Voltron are series that may scratch the anime itch, and he asserts that they are anime, that they count as parts of that movement because they scratch that same itch anime does, that they share a basic appeal with it due to enough common characteristics and seemingly shared design philosophies, and thus should be considered to themselves be anime. Similarly, Japanese animations like Sazae-san would in his eyes not be anime, lacking this shared appeal with those works we typically consider anime. It and shows like it are far more like simple cartoons. This inclusion based upon a similar appeal has some practical benefits, in that properties that appeal to anime fans can be discussed in places where they gather, such as Reddit, but it's also, I feel, this definition's undoing. Who represents anime fans as a whole? What tastes are being used to determine what works do and do not fit into that anime appeal? There's a segment of the anime fandom, an old school one specifically, for which much or even most of modern anime lacks the appeal of anime. In its early days, when anime was evolving out of the kind of stuff that would be relegated to cartoon status by Jeff's definition, it did so mostly through sci-fi, space operas, and mecha series, and then eventually some manly man action series also coming into play. With the increasing prevalence of anime focused on slice of life and cute girls, that appeal, predicated on a kind of masculine romanticism, faded away. Even if we want to make the arbiters of this taste that a work must appeal to in order to be considered anime those who enjoy modern anime, we run into issues. Most people don't like all anime, and for many of them there are entire types of anime that they don't enjoy because specific elements central to that type of anime just don't appeal to them. If a work becomes anime because of sharing elements that make anime appeal to people, and can be discounted as being anime for lacking them, then how can we avoid something like sports anime being barred from consideration as anime, since traditionally they have had trouble gaining widespread popularity in the West? Clearly, for not insignificant portions of the anime fanbase, sports anime lack those common points of appeal. Cute Girls series would probably have this issue to an even greater degree, having large portions of the Western anime fandom that are apathetic or actively hostile towards them for once again lacking the appeal of anime. At this point, the only route I see left for this definition to work is if we say that something is anime if it shares appeal with any anime anyone in the anime fandom likes. This is necessary in order to avoid excluding any given work or subgenre that would be excluded merely because a specific individual or group whose taste is the baseline dislikes it, and brings about the quandary that I believe is the nail in this definition's coffin. Having to open it up this far would, I think, mean that SpongeBob would indeed be considered anime. Surely there are some comedy anime fans for whom SpongeBob holds a very similar appeal to the comedy anime they love so much. Do this with any other work you would think should not be considered anime. There will be people that it appeals to in the same way that anime appeals to them. So-called cartoons that most current definitions would consider to be anime but Jeff's excluded, like Sazai-san and Anpanman, are works which I'm sure some anime fans, specifically those with stronger connections to Japanese culture and entertainment, would find appealing in ways similar to more conventional anime. And all of this is putting aside the foundational issue of anime being defined as things that are in some way like other anime. How do we get the first anime then? It's a chicken and the egg scenario, where something isn't anime unless it's similar to anime, but we can't designate our baseline example as anime without another anime in existence. This is more of a logical paradox here, and the answer to it is simply that there's some things we understand for certain to be anime, and thus have our baseline. But that's just the issue with this as a definition. It relies upon some abstract consensus, some gut idea of what is anime, and doesn't actually define it. What I fail to see here is exactly why we must search for a definition. Really, it just comes back to those practical benefits that I brought up, I think. There are a good number of anime fans that Avatar appeals to in the same way that anime appeals to them, and being able to discuss it in the same place as anime is discussed, in and alongside other discussions of anime, would probably improve things, be something that many people enjoy. The problem is that in doing that, you open the floodgates. As absurd as Dr. Nyanpasu's usage of it was in the context of his point, I think I've laid out how SpongeBob would also be something that could be discussed in places like our anime if we adopted this policy. You might argue that SpongeBob will appeal to far fewer anime fans than Avatar, but so will niche anime like Tonkatsu DJ Agetaro-kun, so exclusion based upon how wide its relevance or interest to anime fans is doesn't really work. The only benefits I can see to nailing down a more concrete definition of anime than that general shared understanding of those Japanese cartoons we all enjoy is allowing some stuff a lot of us really like into those few places with strict rules about keeping things anime specific. I don't think anyone's stopping you at the gates of Anime Expo if you show up cosplaying Aang or Garnet. At most, they're gonna stop you from setting up your Teen Titans Dojinshi booth or hosting your Samurai Jack panel. And even then, you could probably get such a panel greenlit if you just framed it somewhat creatively, tying it into anime as a whole. There's so many other things that also likely appeal to large portions of the anime fandom that you can't post about in our anime or host a panel about. So this argument of inclusion based upon being something people would enjoy doesn't hold water. I guarantee you that there's more anime fans who care about Overwatch and Game of Thrones than care about Nia Under 7, and who care about those things for reasons very similar to those reasons anime appeals to them. Colorful, attractive characters, and dramatic long-form storytelling, respectively. There's certainly tons of non-anime cartoons that would spark more discussion than Turning Girls. A line must be drawn somewhere to prevent everything from turning into a general topic discussion, and I think the practical inability to define anime clearly will unfortunately result in whatever line you come up with being somewhat arbitrary. With all this in mind, I just can't see much of a purpose in putting so much effort into accomplishing something so seemingly impossible, when the only tangible benefits I can see that would come from it would be the ability to talk about some more of the things a lot of anime fans care about in a few anime-centric locations where that's currently frowned upon. There's a lot more benefits to supporting me on Patreon. Joining Sam, Izumi69, Remy Goldschmidt, Joji Matthews, Culver James Kamai, Chris Wagner, Teencho37, Mathwiz97, Zach Penrith, Greg Greenwell, Cherry Boy Writer, Car Keys, Valkion, Mickey Stopwatch, Akai Kuroba, Justin Thompson, Kieran Rice, and all of my other patrons in helping to enable and improve this content.